Professor Hannah Kim walked slowly around her classroom like a hunter watching her prey. The room was filled with strange beings from across the galaxy. Some had blue skin and many eyes that blinked at different times. Others looked like giant insects with sharp claws that made clicking sounds when they moved. In the corner sat creatures made of living crystal that sparkled like diamonds under the bright lights. All of these alien students were here because they were smart, very smart. Their brains worked faster than any human brain ever could. They solved math problems in seconds that would take humans hours to figure out. They understood science that humans were still trying to learn. Professor Kim loved teaching these brilliant minds. She had been doing it for 20 years and was known across the entire galaxy as one of the best physics teachers alive. Students traveled from distant planets just to sit in her classroom and learn from her. Today she was teaching about quantum fields and energy conversion. These were very hard topics that only the smartest beings in the galaxy could understand. The equations floating in the air looked like dancing ribbons of light, but they represented some of the most complex ideas in all of science. The door at the back of the room made a soft whooshing sound as it opened. Everyone turned to look. A young human man stepped inside, trying to be quiet and not disturb the class. His name was Jun Park, and he was only 22 years old. His jacket was old and had been fixed many times with patches. His shoes were worn down from walking long distances. Everything about him showed that he did not have much money. Professor Kim stopped talking and stared at him. Her eyes were sharp and cold. She did not like it when students came to class late. She especially did not like it when human students came late, because most humans struggled in her advanced classes. The other students began to whisper among themselves. Some made clicking sounds that meant they thought something was funny. Others moved their crystal bodies in ways that suggested they were amused. They had all seen human students before. Most of them failed the class within the first few weeks. Humans were still new to space travel compared to other species, while aliens had been flying between stars for thousands of years. Humans had only been doing it for about 200 years. Most aliens thought of humans as a young and not very smart species that was still learning how to use basic technology. Jun found an empty seat in the very back row and sat down quietly. He pulled out an old notebook that was falling apart and a pen that looked like it had been used 1,000 times. He did not have the expensive computer tablets that other students used. He could not afford them. Professor Kim watched him settle into his seat. She had taught many human students over the years. Some tried very hard but could not keep up with the alien minds in the class. Others gave up after a few days when they realized how difficult the material was. A few managed to pass with barely acceptable grades. But none had ever impressed her. She decided to make an example of this late student. It would show the other students what happened when someone did not take her class seriously. "You," she said in a loud voice, pointing her finger directly at Jun. Her voice echoed through the quiet room. "Since you have decided to honor us with your presence, perhaps you would like to solve this equation for the class." She waved her hand, and the holographic display in the center of the room changed. A new set of equations appeared. Floating in the air like glowing snakes, the math was incredibly complex, involving multiple dimensions and energy fields that bent space and time. It was the same problem that had been puzzling her best students for 3 whole weeks. The alien students had tried to solve it using their advanced minds and powerful computers. The blue-skinned Alterians had worked on it with their brains, thinking at the same time. The insect-like Vex had used their natural ability to see mathematical patterns. The crystal beings had focused their energy-based thoughts on the problem for days. None of them had found the answer. This was exactly the kind of problem that would embarrass a human student. Professor Kim expected June to stutter and make excuses. She thought he would admit that he could not solve it and ask to be excused from trying. This would teach him and the other students an important lesson about being on time and being prepared. The alien students turned in their seats to watch the show. Some made soft clicking sounds that meant they thought this would be entertaining. Others shifted their crystal bodies to get a better view. They had all seen this happen before with human students. It was always the same result. June looked up at the floating equations, the blue light from the hologram reflected in his dark eyes. He studied the complex math problem for a few seconds, his face showing no emotion. The room was completely silent except for the soft humming of the building's air system. Then, without saying a single word, June stood up from his seat and began walking toward the front of the classroom. The room became so quiet that everyone could hear their own breathing. All eyes watched as June walked slowly toward the front of the classroom, where the glowing equations floated in the air. His footsteps echoed softly on the metal floor. Professor Kim crossed her arms and waited. She had seen this many times before. The human student would stand there for a few minutes, pretend to think about the problem, then admit he could not solve it. She was already planning what she would say to teach him about being late to class. But something strange happened. June did not look nervous or scared. He did not ask for help or make excuses. Instead, he reached out his hand toward the holographic display and began to touch the floating numbers and symbols. His fingers moved through the glowing math like he was conducting music. He grabbed variables and moved them to different places. He changed numbers and rearranged formulas. His movements were smooth and sure, like he had been working with these equations his whole life. The alien students began to sit up straighter in their chairs. This was not what they expected to see. The blue-skinned Altarians leaned forward, their multiple eyes blinking rapidly as they tried to follow what June was doing. The insect-like Vex stopped their clicking sounds and focused all their attention on the human at the front of the room. Within just a few minutes, something amazing happened. The complex equation that had been unsolved for weeks suddenly made sense. June had found the answer. But he did not stop there. He kept working, pointing to different parts of the floating display. "Professor Kim," June said in a quiet voice that somehow carried to every corner of the room, "there are 3 big mistakes in your quantum field matrix." Professor Kim felt her heart skip a beat. No student had ever told her that her work had mistakes in it, especially not a human student who had just walked into her classroom late. June pointed to one section of the equation, and it began to glow red. "The energy conversion ratio you're using thinks that everything moves in a straight line. But quantum fields do not work that way at this size. They move in curves and spirals." He touched another part of the display, and it turned yellow. "If you fix the quantum fluctuation here," he said, "moving symbols round like pieces of a puzzle, and compensate for gravitational distortion here," another section turned green. "Then the whole problem becomes easy to solve. Not just easy, but useful in the real world." Professor Kim stared at the holographic display. The equations that she had worked on for years were being changed right in front of her eyes. And the changes made perfect sense. She could see now that June was right. There had been errors in her work that she had never noticed. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She watched as this young human student casually corrected work that had taken her team of brilliant alien scientists months to develop. It was impossible, yet it was happening right in front of her. The alien students sat frozen in their seats. Their advanced brains were trying to understand what they were seeing. These beings had evolved over millions of years to be good at mathematics and science. Their minds could process information faster than any computer. Yet a human had just solved a problem that they could not figure out. How did you, Professor Kim started to ask, but her voice trailed off. June turned round to face the class. His expression was calm and relaxed, like solving impossible math. Problems was something he did every day. The mathematics are not that hard once you stop thinking about them the normal way. Humans do not process information the same way other species do. We see patterns differently. In the front row, one of the vexed students began clicking rapidly. The universal translator that everyone wore turned the clicking sounds into words. Impossible. Humans lack the neural processing power for such calculations. The clicking sounds were sharpened. Angry, the vexed student was upset that a human had done something that should have been impossible for his species to do. June looked at the vexed student and smiled slightly. It was not a mean smile or a proud smile. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they know a secret that others do not understand yet. That is where you are wrong, June said in his quiet voice. We do not need processing power when we have intuition. The word intuition hung in the air like a challenge. The alien students had heard this word before, but they had never understood what it meant. Their species had evolved to think logically and systematically. They solved problems by breaking them down into smaller pieces and working through them step by step. But humans were different. Humans could look at a problem and somehow know the answer without going through all the logical steps. They could see connections and patterns that others missed. They could make leaps of understanding that seemed to come from nowhere. The crystal beings in the back of the room began to glow more brightly, which was how their species showed excitement or confusion. The Altarians blinked all their eyes at once, which meant they were thinking very hard about something new. Professor Kim stared at June with no eyes. This was not just a late student who could not afford good clothes. This was something much more interesting and much more dangerous to everything she thought she knew about intelligence and learning. News travels fast in space, and by the next morning, everyone at the Galactic Science Institute was talking about what had happened in Professor Kim's classroom. Students whispered to each other in the hallways between classes. Teachers discussed it over their morning coffee. Even the cleaning robots seemed to beep more excitedly as they moved through the corridors. The story spread beyond the institute, too. Messages were sent to other planets and space stations across the galaxy. Scientists on distant worlds heard about the young human who had solved the impossible equation. They could hardly believe what they were hearing. For 3 years, Professor Kim's quantum field theorem had been famous throughout the scientific community. It was called the impossible equation because no one could solve it. Not even the smartest beings in the galaxy. Teams of brilliant alien scientists had worked on it for months without success. Powerful computers had run calculations for weeks and found nothing. Now, overnight, everything had changed. The equation was no longer impossible. It had a solution. And that solution came from a human student that most people had never heard of before. Scientists across the galaxy were now calling it the Park Solution, named after the young man who had figured it out in just a few minutes. Professor Kim sat in a private office high above the research complex, looking out at the busy laboratories. Below, she had not slept much the night before. Her mind kept going over what she had witnessed. She needed to understand how this had happened and who this student really was. She pulled up June's academic records on her computer screen. What she found there made her sit back in her chair with surprise. The file was much thinner than those of her other students, and the story it told was both sad and amazing. June Park had been born on a planet called Kepler-4b, which was far away at the edge of known space. It was not a beautiful world with cities and universities. It was a mining colony where people went to dig valuable metals out of the ground. Life there was hard and dangerous. When June was only 12 years old, something terrible had happened. The main reactor that powered the mining colony had exploded. Many people died in the accident, including June's parents. They had been engineers who worked to keep the colony's machines running safely. After losing his parents, June had been alone on a harsh world with no family to take care of him. Most children in that situation would have been sent to an orphanage or adopted by relatives. But June had done something different. He had stayed on the colony and taken care of himself. Professor Kim sent an urgent message to June, asking him to come to her office immediately. She needed to hear his story from his own lips. When June arrived, he looked exactly the same as he had the day before. His clothes were still old and patched. His shoes were still worn down. But now Professor Kim saw him differently. This was not just a poor student struggling to get by. This was someone special. "Tell me about your background," she said as he sat down in the chair across from her desk. June looked out the window at the research complex below. His expression was calm, as if solving impossible equations and meeting with famous professors was something he did every day. "There's not much to tell, Professor," he said quietly. "My parents were engineers on the colony. When they died, I kept their books. I started reading everything I could find about physics, mathematics, and quantum theory. Most of it was in alien languages that I had to teach myself." Professor Kim leaned forward in her chair. "You taught yourself alien languages just to read?" "Science books. I had to," June said with a small shrug. The human books on the colony were mostly about mining and basic engineering. If I wanted to learn about advanced physics, I needed to read the alien textbooks that had been left behind by previous research teams, and you have been developing your own theories. Some," June said. He reached into his old bag and pulled out a device that looked like it had been broken and fixed many times. It was a data pad, but not like the expensive ones that other students use. This one was held together with tape and wire. "I have been working on problems related to faster-than-light travel and energy generation," he continued. "The normal approaches all seem limited to me." Professor Kim took the data pad from him with hands that shook slightly. As she turned it on and began to scroll through the pages, her eyes grew wider and wider. The screen was filled with handwritten equations and theoretical frameworks that she had never seen before. These were not just random ideas or simple theories. These were revolutionary concepts that could change everything the galaxy knew about physics. Some of the equations dealt with bending space and time in ways that had never been attempted. Others showed methods for generating unlimited energy using quantum fields. "June," she said slowly, looking up from the data pad, "do you realize what you have created here?" He looked at her with the same calm expression he always wore. "I have always wondered why everyone says certain things are impossible. Usually, when someone says something cannot be done, it just means no one has figured out how to do it yet." Professor Kim stared at him in amazement. This young man was sitting in her office acting like discovering new laws of physics was the most natural thing in the world. On the far side of the galaxy, in a place called Nexus Prime, something important was happening. Nexus Prime was not like other planets. It was the center of galactic government, where the most powerful alien species made decisions that affected billions of lives across thousands of worlds. The building where they met was made entirely of crystal that sparkled like diamonds inside. This crystal palace, 12 different alien species had their own special rooms where they could breathe their own air and live in their own type of environment. When they spoke, computers instantly translated their words into dozens of different languages so everyone could understand. Today was an emergency meeting, and the topic was Junpok. Ambassador Keelix of the Altarian Empire stood in his blue-tinted chamber, his four eyes blinking rapidly as he spoke. The Altarians had been the smartest species in the galaxy for over 3,000 years. They built the fastest spaceships, the most powerful computers, and the most advanced weapons. Other species came to them when they needed help with difficult problems. "This human is a threat to everything we have built," Ambassador Keelix said, his voice carrying through the translation system to all the other chambers. "For 3,000 years, we have been the galaxy's best scientists. We cannot let a primitive species like the humans change that." In another chamber filled with a thick, humid atmosphere, the Vex representative clicked his mandibles together in an angry pattern. The Vex were known throughout the galaxy for their ability to see mathematical patterns that other species missed. They made huge amounts of money by selling their expertise to other worlds. "Our entire economy depends on other species needing our help." The Vex clicked rapidly. "If humans can develop advanced technology by themselves, it will destroy the way things have always worked. The whole galactic order could collapse." Other species nodded their agreement. The crystal beings hummed in harmony, which was their way of showing they were worried. The gas form entities swirled more rapidly in their containment fields. Everyone was concerned about the same thing. A young human had threatened their position as the galaxy's intellectual leaders. Back at the Galactic Science Institute, Professor Kim was having her own problems. She had been called to the office of Dean Yuki Tanaka, one of the few humans who held an important position at the Institute. Dean Tanaka was pacing back and forth behind his desk, clearly upset about something. "Hannah, you need to understand the difficult position this puts us in," he said, not looking directly at her. "I have received messages from 3 different alien governments. They are all expressing concerns about your student's research. They are suggesting that his work might be dangerous if it falls into the wrong hands." Professor Kim felt her anger rising. Dangerous. His theories could solve the energy crisis that is affecting half the colonies in this sector. Millions of people could have better lives because of his work. Dean Tanaka stopped pacing and looked at her with tired eyes. "That is exactly what they are afraid of. Hannah, they do not want humans to become independent. They want us to keep needing their help and their technology." That evening, June was working alone in the physics laboratory. It was late, and most of the other students had gone back to their dormitories. He preferred working at night when it was quiet and he could think clearly. The lab was filled with expensive equipment that he had never been able to afford, and he was grateful for the chance to use it. He was deep in thought, working on a new set of equations, when suddenly all the lights went out. The room was plunged into complete darkness for a moment before the emergency power system kicked in. Red lights began flashing, casting strange shadows on the walls. 3 figures stepped out of the shadows near the back of the lab. They were wearing environmental suits that covered their entire bodies, making it impossible to tell what species they were. The suits had no markings or identification symbols. "Junpak," one of them said through a voice modulator that made his words sound mechanical and threatening. "Your research ends here." But the aliens had made a mistake. They thought June was just another soft student who had lived his whole life in safe, comfortable places. They did not know about his childhood on the mining colony. They did not know that he had grown up in a place where people had to think fast and act quickly to survive. Without hesitation, June slapped his hand on the emergency lockdown button mounted on the wall. Heavy metal doors slammed shut, sealing the laboratory. At the same time, his fingers flew over the keyboard of the nearest computer terminal. He was uploading all of his research data to secure servers located on different planets across the galaxy. The aliens moved toward him, but June was already backing toward the emergency exit. He had memorized the location of every safety feature in the lab during his first week there. just like his father had taught him to do in any new environment. "You can stop me," he said, his voice steady despite the danger. "But you cannot stop. The ideas, they are already out there, and you cannot take them back." The emergency exit opened behind him, and June disappeared into the maintenance tunnels that ran beneath the Institute. The aliens were left standing in the sealed laboratory. Their mission failed before it had really begun. The Galactic Science Summit only happened once every 10 years. And it was the biggest scientific event in the known universe. Scientists, researchers, and brilliant minds from thousands of different worlds traveled across the galaxy to attend. The meeting was held on a neutral planet in a massive amphitheater that could hold over 50,000. And beings, this year's summit was different from all the others. Word had spread across the galaxy about a young human who had solved impossible problems and created new theories that could change everything. Everyone wanted to see if the stories were true. Professor Kim stood at the podium in the center of the vast amphitheater. She looked out at the sea of faces, eyes, and other sensory organs that belonged to hundreds of different species. Some beings floated in the air. Others sat in special chairs designed for their unique body shapes, and a few existed as pure energy contained in glowing fields. Beside her stood June Park. But he was not the same nervous student who had slipped into her classroom months ago. He wore clean clothes that fit him properly, and his posture was straight and confident. Most importantly, his eyes showed no fear or doubt. "Ladies, gentlemen, and distinguished entities," Professor Kim began, her voice carried by powerful speakers to every corner of the amphitheater. "I present to you not just a new theory, but a completely new way of thinking about the universe itself." She stepped aside, and June moved to the center of the stage. The amphitheater fell completely silent. Thousands of the galaxy's most brilliant minds focused their attention on the young human who had once been considered insignificant. June raised his hand, and the entire amphitheater was filled with holographic projections. Mathematical equations floated in the air like glowing clouds. Three-dimensional models of energy fields rotated slowly above the audience. Complex diagrams showed how space and time could be bent and shaped. "For thousands of years," June began, his voice clear and strong, "faster than light travel has required enormous amounts of energy. Ships needed massive reactors and fuel supplies that limited how far they could go. My unified field theory changes that." He gestured to one of the floating holograms, and it expanded to show a detailed diagram of a new type of space drive. "By manipulating quantum fields in a specific pattern, we can create a bubble of altered space-time around a ship. The ship itself never moves faster than light, but the space around it does." The audience leaned forward, trying to understand the implications of what they were seeing. Some beings began making calculations in their heads, while others whispered to colleagues sitting nearby. But June was not finished. With another gesture, he showed them something even more amazing. The same principles can be used to generate unlimited clean energy. By tapping into the quantum fluctuations that exist everywhere in space, we can power entire planets without burning fuel or creating waste. The projections showed power stations that were smaller than traditional reactors, but could generate 1,000 times more energy. Cities that had been dark for centuries could suddenly have all the power they needed. Worlds that had been abandoned because they lacked energy sources could be made livable again. As June continued his presentation, something became clear to everyone watching. This was not just about new technology or better equations. This was about a fundamental difference in how humans thought about problems. The difference, June explained, his voice carrying to every corner of the amphitheater, is that humans do not think in straight lines. We do not accept that something is impossible just because it has never been done before. We see problems as puzzles to be solved, not barriers to be accepted. He looked out at the audience. making eye contact with beings from dozens of different worlds. Other species have evolved to be very good at specific types of thinking, but humans evolved to be adaptable. We survived on a dangerous planet by learning to think in new ways when the old ways did not work. When June finished speaking, the amphitheater was completely silent. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Then, slowly, one being stood up, then another. Soon, thousands of the galaxy's most brilliant minds were on their feet, acknowledging what they had witnessed. Ambassador Kilix of the Altarian Empire was the first to speak. His four eyes were blinking rapidly, which meant he was thinking very hard about something important. The consortium formally requests permission to establish joint research projects with Human Institute. Yushans, other representatives began making similar requests. Species that had looked down on humans for centuries were now asking to work with them. Everyone wanted to learn from the young man who had changed their understanding of what was possible. Within a few months, the first human-led research institute was built on Earth's moon. June was named as its director, with Professor Kim as his chief partner. Applications poured in from across the galaxy. Alien scientists who had once dismissed humans as primitive now competed for the chance to study alongside them. June stood in his new laboratory, surrounded by alien colleagues who had traveled across the galaxy to work with him. The room was filled with the most advanced equipment from dozens of different worlds. But the most important thing in the room was not any machine or computer. It was the human ability to look at a problem and refuse to believe it could not be solved. That ability, June had learned, was the most powerful force in the universe.